Hello, today we're going to be talking about threats to validity in research design. The approach here that I'm trying to point out with the different threats that I'll discuss is essentially focused on helping you determine which designs are more inherently open to specific threats, as well as just to point out the validity threats that exist kind of in every situation. I'm going to try to do this quickly. I have a longer version of this video if you want to slow things down and hear more about each different specific format, but in the effort of trying to have some quick videos to make sure that people actually look at them, um, here is the short version. So anyway, threats to validity in research design primarily focus on quantitative design today. So to start off, you have to understand the notion of variability in research. And I'm not talking about variance, like a statistical measure that you do, but the variability among people, among places, among organizations, whatever you're studying. All of them have some form of variability. And that's a central feature in our research. Even in qualitative research, we may not use the term variability so much, but we are looking for differences among people. That's what variability is focused on. Loosely defined, I like to talk about it as how much difference you can observe in the individuals or settings or conditions that you're examining. And essentially, you should, and I don't like using the word always, but you should almost always have variability in a research study. That's what you're trying to do is figure out what's causing the variance in reported observations or scores or whatever among the people you're looking at, or in the variability of whatever construct of interest you have. And our goal as researchers are to identify what the sources of that variability may be, and then also limit the inappropriate variability that exists in the ways that we can do this research. More on that in a second. So there are two broad things that we focus on when we talk about variability. There's systematic variance or systematic variability and unsystematic. So systematic variance or the is the kind of variance or variability that you can account for by your research design. That is, I expect two groups of people to perform differently. So I'm going to measure whether or not those groups actually do differ on that thing. So for instance, I maybe think that third graders are not quite as good readers as 12th graders. So I give a group of third graders and a group of 12th graders the same reading passage and see who can understand it better. Now, that study will only work if I actually can't mark who's 12th grader and who's a third grader, right? If I just throw everybody into the pile and I don't pay attention to what grade they are, what age they are, then I have a problem with my design. So that's systematic variance. I say, okay, these are my 12th graders, these are my third graders. A lot of people historically have done lots of research looking at just uh, a demographic difference among people to see if there are variations. For instance, a lot of my research is on anxiety, and the research often demonstrates that females report higher levels of academic anxieties than males do. That doesn't mean necessarily they have more anxiety. It just means they report higher levels of anxiety. That's one of those debates in the field. But that's something that we can actually measure, we can look at specifically, and we can control for that variance by knowing who's who. That's why you want to have demographic information in most studies as detailed as you can get. What is the age of the person? What is the gender of the person? What is the socioeconomic status, if that matters? What is the race or the location or the geography of the people that you're studying? What is the kind of school they're at? What is the kind of position that they hold? What year are they? What etc. All those things. Anyway, another uh, group of systematic variance that is very important in quantitative designs, particularly experimental and quasi-experimental studies, is the cause of the independent variable or the treatment variable that I am manipulating. So if I'm going to give an intervention, so this person gets a new intervention focused on promoting reading development, and the other people get nothing, right? So the experimental treatment is the IV, the independent variable, and I'm trying to give that to you. I want to measure who got it, who didn't get it, and then make sure that the changes that I see over time, are they happening in a systematic way where the people who got the independent variable showed greater growth than folks who did not? If you see that, then you have an argument that the independent variable works. That's systematic variance. We expect that change to happen. And then finally are extraneous variables that I can measure. I kind of talk about demographics. But there are other things that just may exist that you know about because that's the thing that you know in your field. So, for instance, when I'm doing anxiety research, I know that a lot of people who have anxiety also have depression. So, I want to know, is the thing that I'm studying really caused or influenced by anxiety? Just anxiety? If I know that depression often comes into play as well, and they're very similar things, I can measure depression as well, and then control for that by putting it into my statistical model and saying, well, let's take out the depression influence and just look at anxiety. And you see a lot of regression designs that we'll talk about where people are doing that. You might talk about mediation, you might talk about moderation, and all other different designs that get very specific in looking at trying to isolate the impact of the variable that you're most interested in. And we'll get into those in much more detail later. But that's systematic variance. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to measure the effects of things that we know we can control for in our design by either measuring it or manipulating it. Unsystematic variance. This is the quote unquote bad stuff. This is stuff in the research design that I have not appropriately controlled for, or just happens in a random way that I can't control for, and can cause issues in getting my precision in my reporting. So one can just be individual differences in the sampler population, right? People differ. That's how it is. And even people who have all the same demographic characteristics, they born in the same place, raised by the same parents, etc. You can still see differences in what will happen among people. Second thing that you could control for, but you don't always get to, is the measurement error. So if I'm collecting data in a school, for instance, and they're using a test that is a bad test, there's a lot of measurement error perhaps in that test, then I know that the precision of my measurements are not as great as I want them to be. That creates extra variance I can't control, and it's just going to mess up my analyses. Not much you can do about that unless you can go back and set up an appropriate study with better measurements. This is, by the way, one of the reasons as a researcher, you want to do a lot of research on the measures you're using and demonstrate that they have been validated. We'll get to that in a different video. Now, once we know about the threats to validity, when we get into the threats to validity, there are two big, broad domains that people usually talk about. Internal threats to validity, where you're looking at, is there something wrong with the design or with the way you've collected data that could lead you to making an incorrect assertion about the impact of the study? So for instance, so specifically saying, are the differences I observe due to the designed intervention, for instance, if I'm doing an experimental study? If I have a threat to internal validity, maybe I find a result and I say, hey, it is because of that treatment I gave. But if I set up my study incorrectly, improperly, or have too much, messiness in my data, I could find that effect with statistics, right? But it may not be true. And so that could be a threat to internal validity, meaning I'm going to make a conclusion that there is a difference or that there's not a difference. But there really is something else happening in the situation that I'm missing. So those threats to internal validity are huge problems. The second broad class of problems with validity are referred to as external validity. And that's a situation where I did the study as clean and as tight as I possibly could, but it only applies to a really limited sample of people in the world. Because for whatever reason, when I did the study, the way that I did it, it's not something that maybe will apply in all cases, all contexts, or whatever. Maybe it won't transfer to a different culture. Maybe another person who is doing the intervention won't be as good at it as I am, and so you won't see the same effects. Or maybe the people that I'm working with are so unique that it doesn't really apply in a broad context. So those are things that lead to external validity. Now, there's a third subclass that a lot of people put under external validity, and it's not It's not, in my opinion, really where it belongs all the time, but they refer to ecological validity. And the way I like to think about ecological validity is that that's a measure of whether or not the study that I'm doing fits the context that makes the most sense for the study for what I'm trying to apply the information to. So that's where it sounds like that external validity. Good ecological validity, an example of that would be if I'm doing a classroom intervention study, good ecological validity would be I'm doing it in a real school and I'm having the teachers do the work. It's as close to the real world situation as what I hope will eventually happen. Not, I'm going to go get some kids 3 days a week, bus them to my lab, do this thing in my lab, send them back to their school, et cetera, and see, oh, will this intervention work for kids all the time? That's not a realistic setting. It's not a realistic population. It's not a realistic thing that someone can do in the future. So that has lower ecological validity. In order for someone to trust that this will actually work in a real school, you're going to want to see it in a real school. Now, the problem I have is a lot of folks will put specific threats to validity that really have components of internal validity threats into this ecological validity and then call it external validity. And I'll explain why I think that's a problem. And I'm going to ask you to be a critical thinker about those things. In the long run, it doesn't really matter which one it is. Is it internal or external? As long as you can explain why it's a threat. That's what I'm concerned about. So, broadly speaking, threats to internal validity. The concern that you have here is that you're going to make an incorrect claim about the findings of your study. You find something, but really there's something else going on that you forgot to pay attention to. The results in the study may be explained by some factors that underlie the the intervention that you're doing or the observations that you're making, or it could be something that you never even thought to measure. There's great old classic studies or stories of how scientists really thought they understood how some chemical process worked because they controlled these conditions and tested stuff and were like, oh look, this always happens. Oh look, this always happens. And they explained that it must be this element that's causing this, and they were wrong because they hadn't discovered, in the case I'm thinking of, oxygen yet. So in pre-oxygen scientific work, there was a construct that they thought was called phlogiston. And phlogiston was supposed to explain all these things in chemistry. And then we discovered oxygen, and suddenly a lot of the things that scientists thought back in those days were wrong, and they had to readjust. And it wasn't because they were foolish or whatever. They're just research design. There was a factor, a variable, an element that hadn't been measured yet, hadn't been discovered yet. Same thing happens in educational research. You do a bunch of studies, you run something, you find, oh, this doesn't work. And then maybe you find out you're doing the intervention in a setting that doesn't make sense, right? You're doing a reading intervention for kids it's designed for kids who have specific learning disabilities, and you're doing the study in a general population classroom. Maybe that's not the right place to do that. So that's an internal validity threat because you're using the wrong context for the intervention. So put it simply, an internal threat to validity is when your results don't accurately explain the reality or the condition of the situation, and you may never know, right? So here's the point. When we're talking about threats to internal validity, we're looking at, have you set up the study as cleanly as possible so that you can account for all of the things that you've thought of that make sense? What if you haven't thought of everything? Well, that always happens. And this is why step one in a good research study is to do a lot of reading and a lot of studying about what other people know about the context and place. That way you know all of the things that really should matter. All right. Next thing, some specific threats to internal validity. And I won't go into these in great detail because this is supposed to be the short version. But these are things that can happen in an experimental design or a quasi-experimental design that will lead to identifying differences among groups when really it could be something else that's causing that occur. So these are threats, things that could cause you to detect a difference between two groups that really may be caused by something else. So one of those is maturation. This is like if I'm doing a study over time and I have just a pre-test and a post-test situation, only one group, no control group. A control group will take care of this problem. That's how good research design works. If I just say, well, I think that this intervention will help kids read better, and I give it to a bunch of kids, test them before, test them later, and say, hey, look, they can read better. I don't know if it's the intervention or the fact that the kids just got older or that the kids, were doing other reading things in a different context. If I have a control group who don't get the intervention, I can compare them and say, the control group is a normal developing group. This is what we expect for their maturation. And I compare that to the folks who had the intervention. Then you have a value added. That's what control groups are meant to do. And the control group is usually the answer for these threats to validity. Second one is a selection bias, where you choose a bad group of people to do a good study. Maybe you choose only gifted kids and compare them to a normal population. That doesn't make a lot of sense, right? And then there's also a selection by maturation possibility. Like if I have a selection threat and a maturation threat, then there's more possibilities for threats to internal validity. Other things that can happen. So the next one here is statistical regression, or also referred to as regression to the mean. That means if I'm doing a long-term study or a repeated measures study, and I select a special group that is really low or really high on some sort of attribute. So for instance, I select gifted kids, and they do a pre-test. Just by the nature of how things work, a group of people are expected to regress to the mean when they're way above the mean. So if I have a test of say an IQ test, and I give it to a bunch of gifted kids, and they score very high. If I give them an IQ test again later, because I think for whatever reason, this camp that I sent them to is not only going to make them know more things, but it's going to make them smarter, and they're going to have a higher IQ. If I give them a second IQ test, the expectation statistically is that their IQs will actually drop as a group, not because they got less smart, but because just the way statistics works, you expect people to come back toward the mean when they're selected because they're at a really high extreme level. By the way, trying to show changes in IQ is it's a terrible idea in general. Mortality is another threat to internal validity. What that means is that people drop out of the study. Yeah, sometimes people just drop out. That's how it is. But sometimes people drop out for a reason. I do anxiety research. If I'm doing an intervention for people with anxiety are more likely to want to stay away from the anxiety. And me talking with them about their anxiety is anxious. So they're more likely to withdraw. So the people who withdraw from the study are more likely to be the more severely anxious people. So that's a real threat to validity. So you have to pay attention to who dropped out. Did they differ from people who didn't drop out? Things like that. Instrumentation, that's just you have a bad measure. Testing, so there's something called the testing effect, um, similar to that regression of the mean, which just says that merely giving you the test can actually change who you are as a person. So educators will often notice that if you give someone a test and do nothing and give the person the test again like a week later, scores often go up. That's called the testing effect. It's a common effect in memory research because actually taking the test was a learning event. This testing thing occurs when just being in exposure to your dependent variable may make a change, not the independent variable, not the thing I'm trying to cause, but the dependent variable. One example of this that some of you might be familiar with is called the stereotype threat. There are lots of research that says if there's a stereotype in your society that says, oh, um, a common one that people did research on about 15 years ago was that society thought that females weren't as good at math. And if that societal belief is out there, and you ask people at the beginning of a study involving their self-efficacy about math, their actual math abilities, or a math test, if you have them complete a demographic questionnaire before the math exam, it creates a stereotype there where they say, "Oh my gosh, I'm doing a math test, and I just had to select that I am female." And because my society says females aren't as good at math, I'm probably not as good at math. And the effect was that math performance was suppressed for females as a large group, regardless of the variations in math expert females versus math novice females. But when you did the demographic survey after the math test, those difference, the drop wasn't observed. So that's one of those cases where just filling out a survey, just answering a question may change the effects of the study. History effects, huge issue here. So if I'm doing an intervention study over a period of time and something else happens in society, in the world around us, that may affect the outcomes of our study. For instance, COVID. If I'm doing this great study about book distribution programs, which is a study we're just wrapping up right now. The first group of people we were studying was in the spring of 2020, and suddenly the world stopped, and all sorts of things went wrong. So when you go to look at, kindergarten reading abilities, and you have a year, 6 months, whatever it is at the schools you're at, where the kids aren't actually in the schools, that really disrupts the performance levels of your population. And you have to just say, this is the data may not be accurate now because the regular context has been changed. And then finally, there's another thing about it's called resentful demoralization of the control group. This is one of those situations where maybe people know that they're the control group. They're like, whatever. And they just don't try. I haven't seen a lot of cases of this, but it is a possibility. Things that can lead to similarities between groups, like reduce the gap in an intervention, or reduce the effects of an independent variable. Something called diffusion of treatment, or seepage, meaning I give teachers an intervention to help them improve the math performance of the people in their classroom. And the teachers are using it, they're like, hey, this is great. And then they share it with their friend who, unknown to them perhaps, or maybe known to them, happen to be the control group. And so the control group suddenly gets this additional benefit that they weren't supposed to get. So when I compare the groups, the control group also shows a gain. And the effect isn't working. It's because of this seepage, this sharing of the materials. Compensatory rivalry, this is the opposite of that situation where the control group gives up. Again, maybe the control group knows they're the control group, and they're like, well, bag that. We're going to beat the experimental group. And so they just try harder. The teacher does more, the kids study more, they do extra things, and it becomes not what we refer to as business as usual control group. We want the control group to be normal. This is the normal context. If for some reason they decide to go hard because they want to beat the group that got the new iPads, or the group that got the new curriculum, or whatever it might be, then it could disrupt it. Again, I don't see this happen a lot, but it is a possibility. And then the last one is more commonly occurring, and that's a compensatory equalization of treatment. This is more likely to occur in a situation where an instructor or an interventionist says, well, I'm going to have half of my subjects or half of my students get the treatment, and half of my subjects or half of my uh, students not get the treatment. And they start doing it for like a week or whatever, and then they realize it works. And then they're like, I can't continue to give one group a leg up over the other group. And so they start to give both groups the intervention, which is the ethical thing in their mind to do. In the end, it ruins the ability to test whether it was actually effective because you've tainted the control group. Threats to external validity, as I said, many people will lump that ecological validity together with this, and I'll try to tease that out a little bit. But the main thing that most people talk about with external validity is population validity, meaning, can I apply the results that I found to a new setting? So threats to population validity are generalization across subjects or participants. And the problem that comes up with this is when you choose a really niche sample, right? Or a disproportionate sample, uh, a, not a good representation of the population that you're trying to apply this to, right? A lot of times I do research on college students, and I collect data, at the college that I teach at, and well, there's more females than males in that population. And so when I collect those data, my sample is often heavily female and low male, or heavily white and low minority, things like that. So when that happens, I have to be mindful and reporting that, say, well, I don't know that these trends will necessarily apply in all contexts to all genders, races, college situations, etc. Another thing that can happen, and this is actually as an educational psychologist who's interested in learning, the interaction of what we call personological variables, those are internal characteristics, your knowledge, your background, your experience, your skill sets, and the treatment effects can occur. So what happens is maybe the intervention that I'm using works really well for a certain group of people. And if I happen to collect data from that certain group of people, it may not apply to all other contexts. You have to be very careful about doing this. Now, some people like to overplay this and talk about personality characteristics that should make a difference, or learning styles, matching things like that. Most of that research has been washed out over time, but there are situations where people maybe who have um, special skills and abilities, and I give them an intervention that taps on those skills and abilities, you may see a growth that won't apply to other situations. So if I'm doing an intervention study on math and I do it with math majors, for instance, maybe they show tremendous gains and show really explosive, uh, unrivaled success in mathematic growth. When I take that to a general population with people who maybe don't have the same background knowledge or the same skill set with mathematics, or pick up math quite as quickly, it may not apply again. And that's that aptitude or ability by treatment, the intervention interaction effects that can cause things not to work as well in a new population. With ecological validity, as I said, there is disagreement about where these things lie. But in my opinion, most things that we talk about as ecological validity, and the list of things that I'm going to list next, are common things that people list in that category. They have both internal and external validity threats. Remember, internal validity threats means that the conclusions I made about my study, about the things that I observed, are actually potentially flawed. And external validity means the conclusions that I made may not apply to other situations. So that what I observed in my setting was true, but it won't necessarily apply everywhere else. Whereas with the internal validity threat, the observations that I made may not be accurate. So that's the thing I really want you to pay attention to. So this long list, I'm not going to go through them all, but they are important things. First one, verification of independent variable or treatment fidelity. That means, did they actually do the intervention that we meant them to do? So, do a lot of studies in schools, a lot of things that say, well, we're going to use this reading curriculum. And you find out they didn't really, because the teacher likes what they normally do and they don't like the new intervention, or they didn't have time to do the intervention as long as you want to. So the way you do that is you go in and you watch them and see, are they actually doing the intervention the way they're meant to be doing it? Multiple treatment interference. I used to do a lot of reading research in schools, and we found, here's our intervention. And we'd be at the school like, wait a minute, what are you doing over there? And they're like, oh, this is this other thing that we're doing. It's like, oh my goodness, because the school was our intervention point, not a specific class. And we don't know now whether our intervention or that other thing was the thing that mattered. So that's a huge problem in school-based research a lot of times. The Hawthorne effect. A lot of people like to talk about the Hawthorne effect, and they talk about it in ways that are annoying to an old guy like me, because when I studied the Hawthorne effect, we talked about the actual Hawthorne studies. The Hawthorne studies basically found this. When I went into a factory and I changed the lighting levels, because I thought, oh, if I increase the brightness, people will work harder. And they did. And then someone said, well, what if we reduce the lighting? They did. And the performance went up again. And what they were showing is that just modifying the environmental conditions could lead to an effect, which is, it was the modification, not what the lights were. It was the fact that something changed and they knew they were being watched, is what people will often say it as, that led to them just changing their behavior in some way. They've done similar studies where they changed the temperature of an office, or the flexibility of seating in offices, all these kinds of things. And it's very similar to what comes next, which is novelty or disruption effects. When I change something, your behavior changes, and it's not necessarily that what I changed mattered, it's just that I changed something. Other people like to talk about the Hawthorne effect as just saying, well, because I know I'm being watched, that's what leads to the effect. And I'm okay with that. But again, and to call that an external validity threat, that I'm not okay with, because what's happened is I've done something that messes with your normal behavior, but the thing that I've done is not really the true causal thing that we're talking about. It's the fact that you're in a study and you think you're going to get evaluated or whatever. It's not the lighting, it's not the temperature, it's not the seating, it's the fact that I'm observing you is probably what's going on. So be very careful with the Hawthorne effect. By the way, I almost never rely on explaining effects as the Hawthorne effect. Novelty and disruption effects are a little cleaner to talk about. And that's just saying, well, I've changed something and it changed your behavior. And why I like the novelty effect better is most people who study the novelty effect show that I modified something, your performance or behavior changed, but if I keep watching you, it fades. It comes back to normal, right? I just changed the seating, your behavior changed for a while, and then you go back to normal, basically. Um, Experimenter effects. What this means is that for whatever reason, the person who's doing the study, collecting the data, doing the intervention is unique in some way, and when other people try to do it, it doesn't work. And that could be because you have expertise, could be because people trust you more than the average person, whatever it might be. Pre-test sensitization is similar to that testing effect, but the pre-test sensitization is set. If I give you a pre-test, now you're primed for it, and it may throw off your intervention success. Post-test sensitization is also a situation where the post-test, merely giving you the post-test may affect your disposition, your response set, whatever it might be. And if I just did an observation without actually you knowing that I was collecting the data, maybe your performance would be different in some way. Finally, history by treatment. That's the situation. Remember, we talked about history effects, or something happens during the course of the study. History by treatment would be a situation where we say, well, cohort one, I'm going to do this study where cohort one is my control group. And so I'm going to look at kids who were in first grade last year. And then first grade this year, they're going to be my experimental group. And we're going to see how they do. And if something happens during only one of those years that is unique and throws things off, that's a history by treatment interaction. Measurement of the dependent variable, ecological validity here. The straw man test. Let me just tell you what I mean by that. A straw man test means that basically I've set up a weak measure of the outcome, meaning that it's not really a good test of the success of the intervention. For instance, if I have a reading intervention, I think the reading intervention is really great at reading comprehension strategies. And my outcome measure is not really a general measure of reading comprehension, but it's a test of, do you understand the book that I've been reading to you all month long as the intervention, whereas the control group never saw the book before. In the end, you're going to show a benefit for the kids because they've seen that same book over and over and over again in the experimental group. So it's a weak test. I'm not really testing general reading comprehension. So if I wanted to see whether my intervention approach with this particular set of books, for instance, is really leading to reading comprehension, a good outcome measure that would test this and show that it really works would be a brand new book that nobody's seen in either condition, right? So it's more basically a fairness approach. And then interaction of time, of measurement, and treatment effects. A lot of people really get caught up on this. One of the books that I use talks about this in a way that I think is inappropriate, and I want to be really clear about this. When you have an intervention, and what they're talking about with the time of measurement is when the measurement is taken with respect to the intervention. So if I have an intervention, a reading intervention again, and I test you at the end of the semester in which that reading intervention was given, that's reasonable, right? If I test you, say, 3 months later after the intervention is stopped, then I may have lost some of the effects of that, and I may not know the true effect of that. Now, another thing, ideally, you would measure it pre-test, immediately at the end of the intervention, say after 3 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever the intervention might be, and then do a follow-up long-term measure to see, did it stick? right? So that's the right way to do it. Now, sometimes when people talk about this, they think it matters what time of day you did the testing. Uh, Unless you're doing like a medicine-based study where, you know, fluctuations in biochemistry might matter, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about with reference to the end of treatment implementation and then the measurement of the outcome or of the dependent variable. Okay, other real quickly, other validity concerns that will come up that you need to be familiar with, and we'll talk about in other contexts. Statistical validity. Um, what we're talking about here is, did you set up your statistical study so that all the levels of confidence are appropriately met? P-values, things like that. Did you use good measures? Is the next one. And we talked about this a little bit before. If I'm using a measure of my outcome of interest. So I say I'm doing again a study on anxiety, and I say, okay, well I'm interested in kids who are anxious in classrooms. So I'm going to ask the PE teacher, who are the anxious kids in the school. That's not a very good measure of anxiety in children, right? They may know, they may not know, right? Or they may not see kids in all contexts. You want to have a measure that gets right at what you really want. By the way, when we talk about measurement validity, a lot of times people will want to develop their own surveys. The more items you have, usually the more precise or more valid your measure can become. Real key critical point there. If I just ask one question, it's usually not very good. And three questions, not great either. You do want to balance it though. You don't want to ask some 8-year-old 50 questions about anxiety. So that's where again you look at what does the prior research on a measure say? Is it a reliable and is it a valid measure going along? And then the last bit here is social validity, meaning is the work that I'm doing useful to the society, to the field, et cetera? And some people refer to this beneficence test, meaning, am I doing more good with the research that I'm doing than the harm or the burden that I'm imposing upon the population that I'm studying? It's an important question for you to deal with. And if you're doing research with human subjects, IRB will ensure that you actually test this or support this. We'll leave it there. Hopefully we got a short one in. I always get going, so apologies if it got longer than I really wanted it to. Have a good day.